Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Marta Esquilin, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the CLAGS board.
Yeah, welcome, everyone. I'm Marta's other co-chair of the board, David Rivera. Welcome.
So before we open up this amazing evening, we just want to talk a little bit about the Kessler Award and about CLAGS. Kessler Award, the annual Kessler Award lecture and reception is a night that acknowledges an amazing individual, a scholar, activist within the LGBTQ community. It's an award that's given to the person who has contributed significantly to queer and trans studies. Some joke it's our LGBTQ Lifetime Achievement Award. Yeah. And so tonight is our opportunity. It is our lecture and reception. But before we open up the evening, I wanted to talk a little bit about CLAGS. As many of you know, we were founded in 1991 as the first university-based research center in the United States, dedicated to the study of historical, cultural, and political issues of vital concern to queer and trans individuals and communities. This year is our 25th anniversary. Can we give some snaps or claps to that? Of sponsoring public programs and conferences, offering fellowships to individual scholars, and much more. I always say that CLAGS our work is about liberation, our work is about justice, our work is about love, particularly at this moment in time, resistance and evenings like this, and our focus on recognizing, celebrating, making visible, supporting financially and otherwise the work of queer and trans scholars, artists, activists is of vital importance. We need to do this for our communities. If others are not. This is the time. So our work is really important. And I want to actually turn it over to David to talk a little bit about our 25th anniversary and our campaign.
Thanks, Marta. So everyone, the work of CLAGS over the past 25 years has been largely possible because of the dedication and the many, many hours that most of them are volunteered by our board. And could our board members who are here please stand? Let's want to acknowledge their countless hours and dedication to CLAGS. Yes, thank you. And also our staff, which we rely on heavily, and they go above and beyond the time that they are actually paid for, and we're very appreciative of that. And I would like our staff to stand, including Noam, who has just left us. Yana, Noam, Isaiah, Yasmina, thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Hi. My name is Kevin Nadal. I am the Executive Director of CLAGS, the Center for LGBTQ Studies, and I'm so happy and honored to be here. I've been the Executive Director for the past 2.5 years. Our Executive Director position is a 3-year appointment, and so this is my 3rd and final Kessler Award. So it's quite bittersweet, but I'm also really, really honored and happy to be here because of the amazing speaker that we've chosen for this year. My job today is to introduce you to some of our speakers. And before I do that, I want to remind you all to participate in our social media. So please tweet, take pictures, quote some amazing quotes that our speakers will share today. And our hashtag today is Kessler 2016. So we have 3 speakers today, 1 person who's here via video, and 2 that are here in person. The first person who will be who had sent a video is Professor Angela P. Harris. Professor Harris joined the UC Davis School of Law, King Hall faculty in 2011. She began her career at the UC Berkeley School of Law in 1989 and has been a visiting professor at the law schools of Stanford, Yale, and Georgetown. She served as Vice Dean of Research and Faculty Development at SUNY, University of Buffalo School of Law from 2010 to 2011. She writes widely in the field of critical legal theory, examining how law sometimes reinforces and sometimes challenges subordination on the basis of race, gender, sexuality, class, and other dimensions of power and identity. She's the recipient of the Rudder Award for Distinction in Teaching from Berkeley Law. Harris is the author of a number of widely reprinted and influential articles, casebooks, and essays in critical legal theory. She was a founder of the Thelton E. Henderson Center for Social Justice at Berkeley Law. At King Hall, she founded and directs the Aoki Center for Critical Race and Nation Studies, a student-faculty initiative that promotes scholarships on issues of race and ethnicity at the law school and beyond. So we have a video message from Professor Harris for Dean right now.
Hi, everybody. Thank you to Yana and the other organizers for this opportunity to honor Dean Spade. I wish I could be there in person. The first time I ran across Dean was in Los Angeles, years ago, at the very beginning of his career. We were at an event where we were both invited guests, and it was a really great event for a great cause, but there was also a serious vibe of privilege and self-congratulation in the room. And when Dean and I started talking afterwards, he named that, and I felt so much better. It was one of those moments where you go, am I crazy, or was that kind of messed up? And the other person is like, yes, that was cool, and also really messed up. The second time I ran across Dean, I think I was listening to him speak. I have a tendency to talk fast, but Dean is probably one of the fastest talking human beings on the planet. And we've all sat and listened to those people who go on because they love to hear themselves talk. But the reason Dean was talking so fast is that his presentation had at least 7 different levels. Dean is one of those thinkers that has read everything, digested everything, and can see how it all connects. And the urgency of his message kept us all on the edge of our seats through a very complicated panel presentation. He was talking through some of the ideas that would later manifest in his path-breaking book, Normal Life. And everyone in the room was aware that we were sitting with a brilliant, original, and passionate theorist. And the next time after that I ran across Dean, it was probably through his writing. Dean does a couple of things in his writing that are amazing. First, he's built upon Foucault's insights about disciplinary power to craft a vision of liberation that takes seriously the limits of civil rights and the limits of law. And secondly, his thinking is intersectional to the core. When writing about the struggles of trans folk, he was using critical race theory as a foundation, not as an analogy. He was not doing that thing that queer advocates sometimes do, of black people got their rights, so we should get ours too. He was using CRT in the manner in which it was intended, not to do a shallow identity politics of here's our group and here's what we need, but to recognize the deep structures of subordination that shape our history and our politics as a nation, the deep racism that has determined how we imagine what it is to be human. His work was not borrowing from CRT, it was CRT. And the next time after that I ran across Dean, it was probably through his organizing. I was looking for models of how you teach racial justice in academic settings, and I discovered the Racial Justice Initiative that Dean had founded at Seattle Law School, a 2-year training program to build a community of faculty, students, and staff who wanted to understand racial subordination and how to fight it. I don't know the next time that I'll run across Dean. I wish it was tonight in the room with you guys. But when I think about the ways in which I've had the privilege to interact with Dean, whether in person or through his speaking, his writing, or his organizing, the common thread is that Dean understands how all forms of subordination are connected. Really knowing that means that all your work has to be coalition work. So I want to end by reading a little bit from Bernice Johnson Reagan's famous speech at the 1981 West Coast Women's Music Festival, Coalition Politics, Turning the Century. She said, "We've pretty much come to the end of a time where you can have a space that is yours only, just for the people you want to be there. There is no hiding place. There is nowhere you can go and only be with people who are like you. It's over. Give it up." And then she goes on to say, "There is not going to be the space to continue as we are or as we were. There was a time when folks saw the major movement force coming out of the Black community. Then the hottest thing became the Native Americans, and the next students' rights, and the next the anti-war movement, or whatever. The movement force just rolled around hitting various issues. Now there were a few people who kept up with many of those issues. They are very rare. Anytime you find a person showing up at all of those struggles, and they have some sense of sanity by your definition, 1, study with them, and 2, Protect them. They're going to be in trouble shortly because they are the most visible ones. They hold the key to turning the century with our principles and our ideals intact. They can teach you how to cross cultures and not kill yourself. Dean Spade is one of those rare people who shows up at all the struggles and is very, very sane, as well as, I'm guessing, often in trouble. I want to thank CUNY and the CLAGS Center folks for recognizing that Dean is a person we all need to study with and to protect. And Dean, thank you for doing what you do. Congratulations on this wonderful and well-deserved award.
I'm gonna mess up my eye makeup. Thank you to Professor Harris, who might be watching us live streaming. So right now, everyone, we're live streaming the millions or tens of people online watching us today. We have two more speakers who I have the privilege of introducing. I'll introduce them both, and then they'll both give their very kind words. So first, we have Craig Willse, who is an assistant professor of cultural studies at George Mason University. He's the author of The Value of Homelessness, Managing Surplus Life in the United States, and co-editor with Patricia Clough of Beyond Biopolitics, Essays on the Governance of Life and Death. He co-edited with Sonia Munshi a special issue of The Scholar and Feminist Online, Navigating Neoliberalism in the Academy, Nonprofits, and Beyond, and with Dean Spade, a collection of essays about the film Born in Flames for Women and Performance. At George Mason, Craig is faculty advisor for Students Against Israeli Apartheid, and he is a member of the organizing collective for the U.S. campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel. So round of applause for Craig. And second, we have Reina Gossett, the former membership director at the Silvia Rivera Law Project and director of the Welfare Organizing Project at Queers for Economic Justice. An activist, writer, and filmmaker, she is the recipient of the George Soros Justice Advocacy Fellowship by the Open Societies Foundation for her work with LGBT people navigating criminalization, and a 2009 Stonewall Community Foundation honoree collaborating with Sasha Wurtzel on Happy Birthday, Marsha, a film detailing the lives of Sylvia Rivera, Marsha P. Johnson, and street transvestite action revolutionaries. In 2013, Reina was awarded with a BCRW Activist Fellowship for her work at the intersections of trans justice and prison abolition, and to support her ongoing work to document and elevate the histories and legacies of trans women of color, Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, as well as other contemporary activists and political projects. So please welcome both Craig and Reina.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, all of you, for being here, and I especially want to thank Kevin, Yana, David, Marta, and everyone else at CLAGS for all your work making tonight possible. I know it's a lot of work. I also want to thank the Lenape and the other indigenous communities of this land for the space that we share tonight. As the water protectors move cautiously forward from the recent victory at Standing Rock, I'm especially grateful for the brilliance and persistence of indigenous resistance. I'm very happy to be here with so many friends and so many activists and scholars who have been key to my development, and I know to Dean's as well. It's really wonderful to have so many people from so many different parts of Dean's life here tonight. This kind of coming together usually only happens at weddings, but apparently Dean didn't want a wedding. I don't know, there was like an issue with that. So we had to do this instead. Like many of you, I'm sure, these past few weeks, I've been kind of reeling, struggling to get my bearings and to clear my head. But while preparing for tonight, I realized that Dean's writing and work have given us exactly what we need, not only to survive the Trump years, but to come through these years stronger, smarter, and in fact, closer to realizing our collective vision for a just world. So I thought I would speak tonight to some of what I've learned from Dean that I think can help us find our way forward. The first lesson is, you always act. I met Dean in the fall of 1997 when I first moved to New York. We met through an activist group called Sex Panic that had formed to fight crackdowns on public sexual culture under then Mayor Rudy Giuliani. Yeah, you can hiss when I do, yeah, perfect. We're gonna have to get back in that practice. I'd read an article about sex panic during my last semester of college in Florida. I'd like to think the article was in The Advocate, but I feel like it might have been in Out magazine, but I was doing the best that I could. So I moved to New York, I joined Sex Panic, and I met Dean, who it turned out would change the course of my life. I was immediately caught up in Dean's sense of urgency and responsibility, and I found myself, within months of our first meeting, out pasting posters about police brutality in the East Village, handcuffing myself to other protesters in the middle of the St. Patrick's Day parade, making stickers about surveillance cameras in Washington Square Park, and organizing DIY events to counter the corporate takeover of Pride. In all these cases, Dean taught me, if something needs to be done, you do it. And another lesson I've learned is, you better clear your schedule because Dean has a lot of work for you. Dean has also taught us to make use of all the resources available. Dean doesn't limit his writing or thinking to loyalty to an established belief system, but draws inspiration where he finds it. If something moves us, then it's what we need. In Dean's case, this has been women of color feminism, Black studies, Native studies, critical race theory, disability studies, anarchist theory, feminist science fiction, young adult fantasy novels, self-help books, astrological readings, online personality tests, and the underrated television show Roswell, which was broadcast on the WB from 1999 to 2002, and depicted the forbidden love between teenage humans and aliens. If you are unfamiliar with Roswell, there are a variety of tribute videos on YouTube to which Dean can direct you. From all these wide-ranging and unexpected sources, Dean has found ways to imagine and create new forms of social justice. Another lesson from Dean: you take your personal experiences and turn them out into the world. We often hear the phrase, the personal is political, and I think sometimes this is taken to mean that making good personal choices is enough. Dean has demonstrated that at its most powerful, this statement shows us that our personal experiences are yet another resource for connecting with others to build something bigger than any of our individual lives, but through which all our lives become more full. When a group of us, and I'm happy to say many of those people are in the room here tonight, participated in protest against the World Economic Forum in 2002, Dean was arrested after the protest trying to use the bathroom at Grand Central. Dean took what was a terrifying experience and immediately turned it out into the world. His writing and speaking out about the arrest connected him to trans people around the country who shared their stories of violence and harassment in bathrooms. Those conversations led Dean to found the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, which today continues to be a life-saving force and a model for trans activism and organizing around the US and the world. In response to that arrest, Dean also reminds us that you take your work seriously, but yourself not too seriously. Dean led us in creating a zine about the experience, which he aptly titled Piss and Vinegar. And if you want copies of the zine, you can try us at the email address Dean set up, letusp@yahoo.com. It is also worth noting that at the time of that arrest, Dean was 6 months into what was supposed to be a 2-year clerkship for a federal judge. He decided to quit the clerkship and pursue funding to get SRLP started. When Dean quit the clerkship, which was very prestigious, many people warned Dean that he was making a huge mistake and was throwing his career away. It turned out that wasn't quite true. And so another lesson is don't listen to all the advice you're given, especially when that advice is about what you can't do. SRLP began as a project housed by the Urban Justice Center, an umbrella organization of social justice projects. The very first thing Dean did upon joining the Urban Justice Center was send a letter to all the employees about the need to establish a trans-affirmative policy of gender-neutral bathrooms in their shared building. This is a very Dean move, not to start with the easy ask, but with the necessary demand. And so from here, we learn the lesson that you do not wait for the right time. You take the moment we're in and transform it into the moment we need. Our next lesson: everyone is a potential ally, and you never stop recruiting. Dean can address a room full of prosecuting attorneys, and we'll start with something like, because we all oppose the settler colonial state and are committed to ending capitalism, we know prison abolition is the only way forward. And the prosecuting attorneys will find themselves, having been hailed by Dean, nodding along. Dean presumes the best in people and has shown all of us what can be accomplished when you do political work as a way to invite people in. And Dean does that inviting with the passion of a convert, whether he is trying to convince someone to help stop construction of a youth jail in Seattle, or to read a cookbook about ancient grains that Dean swears will change your life. And the thing is that that cookbook probably will change your life. Yeah. This passion is important because it is a source of joy, and we need that joy to sustain us, because Dean has also taught us never to be satisfied, because nothing short of our complete liberation is enough. But the good news is that Dean has also shown us that we are the liberation force we need. Strong, creative, serious but not too serious, resilient, determined. We need now deeply the vision of justice Dean has been building for years in his written work and activist collaborations. A thorough reimagining of redistribution that does not allow the state to decide who is deserving of resources. Movements that prioritize the needs and analyses of the most vulnerable members of our communities. Strategies that refuse the divide and conquer tactics of liberal multicultural inclusion, and that are committed instead to what Dean has termed a politics of no exile. We need today, as Dean wrote in 2002, to dress to kill and fight to win. And fighting to win, this is key. Dean has written about trans justice work in terms of the politics of impossibility, meaning the political struggles of those who were never meant to exist. But I think the corollary to the politics of impossibility is how Dean himself lives. So lastly, Dean has taught us to live and work as if anything you want is possible. We must live as if war can be stopped, as if Israeli apartheid can be dismantled, as if poverty can be eliminated, as if prisons can be abolished, as if Trump and his white supremacist cronies can be beat back. We must live as if the world we want, in which all of us are free to be our most beautiful and weird and inspiring selves, as if that world is just waiting for us to make it so. It is for this lesson I am most thankful. So thank you, Dean. I am looking forward to the fights ahead.
Hi. So thank you first to Marta and Kevin and all the staff at CLAGS and CUNY for recognizing the brilliance of Dean Spade and hosting and awarding Dean. This is a really meaningful night for me to participate, so thank you. I am going to do three things. I'm going to read Dean's bio. Before that, I'm going to play a clip of a conversation that happened with Dean and I really recently, and about kind of pivoting in new directions in this Trump world, right? How to be strategic. And before that, I'm just going to talk a little bit. I wrote some remarks specifically about Dean, and I also think that sometimes I give the best testimonials just speaking from the heart, so I'm going to try to do that, which is a rare thing for me. Dean and I have collaborated a number of times, specifically with Barnard Center for Research on Women, on a set of teaching tools called No One is Disposable. How many people have heard of those teaching tools? Yeah. They wouldn't have happened without Dean Spade inviting me in, and that's been a theme of my work with Dean for about a decade. When I was a young organizer in 2006, I remember getting an invitation from Dean when he was teaching at UCLA, inviting me to speak about trans liberation and criminalization. And I was like, I don't really know. I've never gotten on a plane and flown to LA. I'd never been to LA the first time. At all, and I'd never spoken on a panel about trans liberation and criminalization. Like, can I really do this? And Dean really wasn't having it. Dean was like, these are issues that I know you're passionate about, affect your life, you have lived experience. I think you're the right person, but I'm going to let you decide. And that was really a running theme in my relationship with Dean. As a young organizer, as someone who was searching for my people, who always knew that trans liberation is inextricably linked to the abolition of the prison industrial complex. Dean has been there carving out space within social movements for those of us to participate in, who have that kind of analysis and who have that lived experience. And, you know, shortly after the UCLA conversation, Dean invited me into the Transforming Justice Conference. How many people remember that in 2007? A few of us were in the room, yeah. So the Transforming Justice Conference was a conference that happened in the Bay that came out of, in part, TGIJP, Trans Justice Intersex Justice Project, and Trans in Prison, another organization doing Marvelous Mondays of working with people who were trans and gender nonconforming and who just left prison, really local work. To think about and break down what are the conditions shaping our lives, right, as transgender nonconforming people, and specifically those folks in the Bay. Knowing that when we break isolation, we build the power with each other to take on the conditions that shape our lives and harm so many of us. And, you know, I remember being at the Social Forum in 2007 with Dean, driving in a car, and I was like, I don't really know, should I participate in this conference? And I just really needed that kind of mirroring back that actually my voice is powerful, I have something to contribute, I'm someone who is incredibly affected by these issues, and yes, of course, I should be in that room creating space with other people. So more recently, Dean, as I've left the kind of work of being in a nonprofit, Dean has really pushed me to feel a sense of power in my art making, right? Knowing that Dean says that art making has always changed the world, right? How we fashion ourselves, how we create images of ourselves has always been a tool of resistance. And it really pushed me to think about the ways that my interior condition still holds so much capitalism, right? So sometimes capitalism in the form of the nonprofit saying, the only tools that work are ones that the state allows for and the state says are okay. And constantly having the voice of Dean pushing back against that, saying that art is transformative, fashion is transformative, they're part of social movements, has been a really powerful thing for me. So the last kind of way that I feel like Dean has really pushed me to think about my interior condition is something that he says a lot, right? Which is, in this moment, after civil rights legislation, there's an idea that poverty and laziness are cousins, right? That if you're having a hard time, it's your own fault, right? That illness and death and disability are personal failings. And I really want to emphasize how important that work is, right? Not just the kind of institutional work and that framework around trans liberation is inextricably linked to prison abolition, but also that capitalism can live in our interior conditions, and that it's so important to think about how we replicate those values. And for me, something that Dean supported me in was asking for help, right, when we need it, right? So people who need help are often left out of movements. And so I think that's something that has been so meaningful for me, is looking to Dean as a person to carve out space within social movements for myself, as a person to push me to be in the world in the ways that I need to right now, as someone working in art as a transformative power for social movements, and to constantly be thinking about my interior condition and knowing that we all, in order to create possibility and transform our conditions, need to be working together. So with that, I'm going to play a video that Dean and I just recorded. I did it earlier today with Dean. I was down in Washington, D.C. in Dean's new space there, and it's really great. You'll see it in the video. Since the election, there's been a lot of conversation about pivoting in the face of the Trump administration, and Dean has been in the leadership of that too, right? Offering some of his most radical analysis yet. Radical, Dean reminds us, doesn't always have to mean looking at root causes. Sometimes, to do radical work, Dean says, you can do it from inside an institution, top down, and very, very incrementally. So as part of our ongoing collaboration series with the Barnard Center for Research on Women, I was really fortunate to go to Dean's new office in Washington, D.C. as he prepares for the inauguration and talk about something that I know is really close to an issue that's really close to Dean's heart, which is marriage equality. So I'm going to play it now. I'm Reina Gossett, and I'm here at the Human Rights Campaign headquarters in Washington, D.C. to interview Dean Spade, new Trump appointee for lesbian and gay equality, about what marriage equality really is. What, to Dean Spade, is marriage about now?
Marriage is about love, and marriage is about being happy and having a child, and the deepest relationship two people can have.
That sounds amazing. Tell me more.
There's over 1,000 benefits to marriage. Prop marriage up, make marriage the center, make all benefits go through the family, defund poverty alleviation and disability and programs for old people, and deal with that in your family.
Given your vast knowledge of marriage, do you have advice for the single ladies out there?
There's a man shortage and you've got to find the right man, and women have to define their happiness in life around whether or not they can get married. And nothing satisfies and makes your life good like having children. Children are better off when they're raised by a married couple. People who are wealthy should be able to adopt babies. Poverty occurs because people aren't married enough.
It seems like there's a lot of reasons to support marriage. Thanks for meeting me, Dean.
There's incremental change going on. We're just going to start with people at the top.
All I want is you when you be my bride. Take me by the hand, stand by my side. All I want is you when you stay with me. Hold me in your arms, sway me like the sea.
I'm just gonna leave that image up. So it's my pleasure to offer Dean's brilliance to the room. I'm going to read Dean's bio and just a little bit about Dean. Dean is an associate professor at the Seattle University of Law. He teaches administrative law, poverty law, and social movements. Prior to joining the faculty of Seattle University, Dean was a Williams Institute teaching fellow at UCLA Law School and Harvard Law School, teaching classes related to sexual orientation and gender identity law and social movements. In 2002, Dean founded the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, a nonprofit law collective that provides free legal services to transgender, intersex, and gender nonconforming people who are low-income and/or people of color. SRLP engages in litigation, policy reform, and public education on issues affecting these communities, our communities, and operates on a collective governance model, prioritizing governance and leadership of trans, intersex, and gender nonconforming people of color. Can we just give like a round of applause to SRLP and the amazing work that it does? From 2012 to 2014, Dean was a fellow at Engaging Tradition Project at Columbia Law School. His book, Normal Life, Administrative Violence, Critical Trans Politics, and the Limits of the Law was published in 2011 by South End Press. In 2015 by Duke University Press, which was publishing its second edition, and in Spanish by Bella Terra Press. In 2015, he released Pinkwashing Exposed, Seattle Fights Back, a documentary examining the concept of pinkwashing by telling the story of a successful fight by Seattle queer and trans activists to cancel a propaganda event sponsored by the Israeli consulate, Stand With Us, and the city of Seattle's LGBT Commission. That's amazing, Dean. His other video work projects can be found in Barnard Center for Research on Women, and has been a longtime collaborator with Hope Dector. So thank you, Dean Spade. Yeah, I'm going to invite you to the stage.
That made me laugh really hard. Oh my God. Not that I ever want to be done looking at that picture of Hope and Reina and I on our wedding cake. Thank you so much to Angela and Reina and Craig for those lovely, really hilarious, embarrassing remarks. And also thanks so much to the CLAGS board and to Yana and Kevin and David and Marta and everyone for the opportunity to receive this award. You know, CLAGS is so meaningful to me. I feel like in some ways I grew up with CLAGS. Like I moved to New York in 1995, and so many CLAGS events were so vital to shaping my intellectual and political life, and so memorable. And my time on the CLAGS board was so meaningful to me, and it's just really wild to get an award from an organization where it's such a meaningful award to me and such a meaningful event. Like I watch this lecture every year. If I'm not in town, I watch it on the computer, and I just really, I'm really moved by it and really grateful. So thank you. Yeah, and I also agree that you should give to CLAGS. I really enjoyed fundraising for CLAGS when I was on the board. It's actually like a really right-on thing to give to. How amazing is it that CLAGS is part of CUNY, like it's part of like an institution. like, I really care about CUNY, really care about CLAGS being part of CUNY, and I hope we can keep lifting up this as a really vital site for queer and trans studies. Yeah, and I also want to acknowledge the land. You know, we're on Lenape land. The Lenape were forced to leave Manhattan in the 1770s and moved to Oklahoma. A lot of people are still in Oklahoma and in Wisconsin and Ontario. And, you know, it's a really wild moment to give a talk like this right after the election. I had to like really rethink what I wanted to talk about, and I think it's a hard time to think about what we want to say to each other for a lot of reasons. There's a lot we're all figuring out. And I think part of what a lot of us are doing is trying to figure out what's the same and what's different right now, and how does it affect what we're going to do. And I think a central way to understand that is to understand that we live in a settler colonial context and the colonial government has changed. And that how does centering that mode of inquiry affect our analysis and our ability to strategize this moment. So I just want to suggest that as a way to sort of something to carry through these remarks and our discussion afterwards. How do we use that to assess what's the same and what's different? How can we think about being on Lenape land the entire time that we think about the Trump moment or anything else we want to kind of consider about now and about our strategies? But it's an intense moment. A lot of people feel really scared, I think. There's a lot of fear going around. There's a lot of shock going around. And there's also an idea that maybe a lot of people are mobilizable right now because there's a set of people having like shock and fear in new or different ways. And so I think one of the main questions for me that I want to think about tonight is like, what will people be mobilized around? You know, that's pretty much up in the air. There's actually a battle we have to have about what constitutes leftness or progressiveness right now, and there's actually a lot we could lose in that battle. And in some ways, we've always been battling that, but I think there's a particular kind of moment about that battle right now. So I want to spend some time talking about that tonight and about some of the kind of pitfalls, some of the threats, and some of the opportunities for us in this context of this moment. And during the last year, a lot of what I've been talking about and thinking about has been like how we respond to and navigate two really big forms of mainstreaming that have been happening. Like obviously there's been a mainstreaming of trans politics and images of trans lives have been more visible. And there's also been a mainstreaming happening around criminal justice reform. And both of those things were things that like, I'm not sure I knew I would see in my lifetime. They've been pretty wild, right? Like pretty big things to have happen and a lot to kind of traverse. Like, you know, on the one hand, those are signs of the significance of our movement work, that we have this long, ongoing, you know, prison abolition movement, anti-policing movement, and we finally are seeing some criminal justice reform, you know, mainstreaming. There's some signs, that's maybe good signs about our movement's work, the many movements that feed into that moment, and about the sort of trans mainstreaming, but also mainstreaming prevents like significant threats to our aims of actually winning trans survival, winning prison abolition, winning police abolition. So I've been thinking about that stuff a lot. I want to say a few things about that. So mainstreaming, Caitlyn Jenner, she's a good symbol of it. Right, so this is just quick sort of like summary of some of my thoughts around mainstreaming, right? So one of the things mainstreaming does, it creates new forms of visibility, whether that's Caitlyn Jenner on the cover of Vanity Fair, or whether that's like a bunch of sheriffs and prosecutors coming out and saying that they're gonna like take care of criminal justice problems for us and you don't worry about it, go back to sleep. Whatever it is, we see circulation of new forms of visibility of issues that we felt were, you know, side conversations, right, or really marginalized conversations before. Another part of what comes with mainstreaming is conditional acceptance, right? I mean, if you can do white femininity like Caitlyn Jenner, you might be okay. But most trans people, like, too bad, right? I actually had a really powerful conversation with Chase Strangio the other day. Chase was talking about how, on the one hand, you see Loretta Lynch, you know, representing the Obama administration, saying we're going to sue North Carolina about their bathroom bill. And we're going to say, you know, trans women are women and trans men are men and they should get to use the bathroom. And that exact same administration its lawyers are fighting tooth and nail to make sure that Chelsea Manning can't grow her hair out. So you start to think like, oh, like what trans people are human for this administration, right? So conditional acceptance becomes very, very visible in moments of mainstreaming. What else do I have here? Deployment of deserving figures, right? So we got like, whether that's nonviolent offenders, maybe they deserve some relief from the criminal system, but not everyone else, right? Or whether that's Caitlyn Jenner. So you get the idea of who is deserving, who will be the trans people we can accept. You can think about this in terms of like those memes that have gone around during the bathroom panics, the memes that'll show a picture of a very passing trans person and say, well, like you'd want this person, you wouldn't want this person in the other bathroom, would you? But what about everybody who's trans who gets harassed in bathrooms because we are hard for people to understand, right? So like it's just this kind of very limited idea of like kind of who's the subject we can accept as deserving of rights or survival. We get recuperative reform proposals. I'm gonna talk about this a bit more, right? But you get reform proposals that actually recuperate existing systems that are under attack. So reform proposals that actually make it seem like contradictions have been resolved and kind of put a legitimizing face on existing harmful systems. After that, you still have the same harm and violence to the same vulnerable people. So like one thing that always happens is we're told it's been taken care of, right? You're free, and yet people still continue to die early. And then oftentimes you also get backlashes, right? So I see like the bathroom panic as an example of this kind of, there's these backlash moments that actually enhance vulnerability. So you haven't even won that much, but you get this really, so like a few people at the top have won something maybe, but you get a backlash that really hurts people at the bottom, right? It's like the people who are most vulnerable have to use the bathrooms in the most dangerous places, that's who's gonna be harassed. It's low-income people, it's people who look or are homeless, it's people who are people of color or people with disabilities. That's who people are uncomfortable with in the bathroom. But the people who maybe got some minor relief at their job around their campus, they're, you know? So it's like the who wins and who really loses part is also an interesting part of this dynamic. And we could look at that more broadly in like gay and lesbian politics as well. So, you know, long-term things I've been thinking about in all of this is kind of how do we assess pitfalls of reforms, right? Some of the things we're always concerned about, and this is also about like the battle for, right, what is left, what is progressive. We don't want reforms that produce no material relief. We get a lot of reforms that produce no material relief, like, you know, classic example, hate crime laws, right? They don't do anything to prevent people from killing us, but we're told we've been recognized by the state, right? So we don't want reforms that produce no material relief or that are solely symbolic. Like where I live, there's right next to Seattle is a jurisdiction called Federal Way. The school board there just passed kind of like an anti-hate proclamation. And it's like they did it in response to the fact that there's like people terrified, the kids in the schools are terrified that their parents are gonna be deported. But it doesn't do anything to prevent that. It doesn't even say the words immigration or deportation in the proclamation. So just being concerned about like reforms that are solely gestures, I'm hoping that that will be followed up by other things, but that's a really common thing right now. People are coming out against hate, but there's literally no like administrative reality that shifts, right? It's like, you know, we get relief that only reaches the least marginalized. So like, you know, that's a really common thing in general with all sort of civil rights frames is the danger that the only people who end up accessing relief are like the people with the most high-ranking jobs, the access to the highest levels of healthcare, highest levels of education. We get reforms that just legitimate the systems, right? We're gonna put an anti-discrimination law in your prison. So it's like, we're still gonna imprison the same people, they're still gonna be targeted and tortured and raped, but now the system gets to say, we've got like a wrapping around it. We've wrapped a rainbow flag around this or that, right? This is the term pinkwashing that, that was mentioned. We've got the concern of reforms that tinker but don't reach root causes. So the same people are ending up being funneled into criminalization or deportation, but maybe we've tinkered with something that happens like at the 11th hour only, right? So that's always a danger of reform. And also the danger that we expand harmful systems. So like hate crimes laws are such a good example of that, right? When we actually expand prosecuting power in the name of our communities. Okay. Oh, and then of course the concern that reforms that divide people into deserving and undeserving. You know, we've seen this conversation a lot in the context of immigration discourse in recent years, where it's like we don't want, you know, Obama's like, I want to make it so that a few college students can stay, but we're really going to go hardcore after people who've had contact with the criminal system, right? Like who are good immigrants, who are bad immigrants, who are good trans people, who are bad, who are good whoever, right? So these are kind of common pitfalls. Seattle has this sticker campaign. They put stickers in the windows of businesses that say like, this is a safe place because we'll call the cops for you. If you're experiencing an anti-LGBT attack, you can run in here and we'll call the cops. This was a PR campaign that came after the Seattle Police Department had some really, really well-publicized horrible killings, including the murder of John T. Williams, an indigenous woodcarver. The Seattle Police Department was under the DOJ investigation, which found that it engaged in excessive force and bias, and these words are, you know, limited. And so then their response is a PR campaign using a symbol of gay rights, right? Like the rainbow flag. This is very common. A bunch of other cities have now picked up on this brilliant idea. There's a really good activist counter sticker that I should have brought a picture of. Another one from right here in the city, you know, the same story, right? Like the NYPD, it's so progressive now. Maybe this is in poor taste, but I feel like it's, you know what I mean? It's like this idea, oh, it's like if women are in the military, it's a site of liberation. What does the US military do? and then this horrible nostalgic image. Okay, so those are just like, right, these for me are images of like the limits of mainstream reforms. So a counter frame that's really been important to me for thinking about this, that I think can help us through this dilemma when we're battling for what is progressive, what is left, what is liberatory, is a frame of counterinsurgency, or frame of warfare, right? Lots and lots of the movements and scholars we all look to use this frame, and I think it really is clarifying and useful for moving us towards criteria for assessing our way forward. You know, one place that I get this frame is from the 1951 petition, We Charge Genocide. Has anyone gotten to read that? It's always a good thing to reread and reread. You know, by W.B. Du Bois and William Patterson and Paul Robeson. A document that in 1951 laid out and described exactly how the United States is engaged in genocide against black people. It's this incredibly useful document. These people, like their passports were taken, the copies of it were seized. Like the danger of this document that identified a genocidal act against black people by the United States was so palpable at the time. And the document itself, even though now it reads as like pretty dense, like, you know, lots of evidence, it was like a popular document that like thousands of them were printed. People wanted to read it, you know? That's like sort of a spark moment where we see the value or the vitality of this kind of frame. But we can see it in a lot of places. I was thinking about the writing of Kwesi Balogun. I'm thinking about many 60s and 70s movements and figures, including political prisoners from those movements, who use the idea that the United States is at war against black people, at war obviously against indigenous people, at war against people of color generally, at war against social movements, fighting back. I think the Black Panther Party used a warfare frame, the Young Lords, the American Indian Movement. I think even more recently, analysis of the war on terror. People have really understood it as a war against immigrants, war against Muslims. There's a lot of, I think the Black Lives Matter framework has also used this to understand state violence against black people. Many, many scholars and many activist movements have used this frame to help us see the United States as a war, the existence of the United States itself as war, and the United States' ongoing warfare against vulnerable people and against our movements. And the bottom line is the United States government treats, like they use counterinsurgency as their frame to deal with our movements. So we should think of it that way, right? Like that's how they think of it. So we should, right? So this frame has been really, really useful to me. And counterinsurgency, according to some scholars, I'm thinking right now of Peter Gelderloos and Christian Williams, among others, is broken into two pieces, repression and recuperation, right? So maybe we could think about, like maybe one thing that might be different under Trump is like, will there be any difference? Will it be more repression and less recuperation, right? Like, because we could see Obama as like a major pinkwashing president. He's like, I'm pro-gay, so just ignore the drone warfare and the millions of deportations and the, you know, what's going on in Yemen and what's going on in Iraq and what's going on in Afghanistan, what's going on at Guantanamo. Like, just ignore that. I'm pro-gay marriage, right? Like we can see the recuperation piece really clearly in the Obama administration and the attempt to recuperate institutions in crisis like the U.S. military or the U.S. police state and prison nation through various, you know, attempts to say they're pro-women or pro-gay or whatever. We can see the recuperation piece, but it's not as if Obama didn't engage in repression. I mean, we know that, like, you know, he's expanded surveillance, domestic surveillance, you know, wildly, including targeted at groups like Black Lives Matter. But maybe under Trump we'll see more repression and less recuperation. I don't know. But repression and recuperation, counterinsurgency, it's going to stay with us. It's been with us through all the presidencies. It's still part of it. And it's really vital to understanding, I think, this warfare frame and how we do this assessment. So I'm just going to give you a quote from the U.S. government about counterinsurgency. It says, counterinsurgency integrates and synchronizes political, security, economic, and informational components that reinforce governmental legitimacy and effectiveness while reducing insurgent influence over the population. Counterinsurgency strategies should be designed to strengthen the legitimacy and capacity of government institutions to govern responsibly and marginalize insurgents. So I think this is useful. Understanding the government's thinking about what counterinsurgency is useful for thinking about what we need to be doing, to me. And part of the way that I've been thinking about this is like understanding in the Trump moment what kinds of liberal myths are new dangers for us as we contest the terrain of what we're going to decide is left or progressive politics and how we're going to pick up strategies and whether we're going to have strategies that just simply keep recuperating the U.S. government and its institutions or whether we're going to actually increase and expand our work to dismantle them. So some of the liberal myths I want us all to be keeping our eye out for. the myth of education. If people only knew, then this wouldn't be going on. One of the worst, so the concern that education alone is going to get us there, that if people knew, this has a lot of problems. One problem is we all get stuck writing too much fucking content on the internet. It's not enough. It's just not enough, right? The idea that if we had the right analysis, if we had the right meme, if we had the right app, that we would finally, people would understand and things would be all right. You know, we need a zillion ways of understanding, thinking, and seeing everything because we're all really different from each other, so there's not going to be like a one silver bullet. Like, that's a very, like, kind of, that feels like a funder's idea. Like, let's find the one, you know. No, there's not, like, nobody's special. Everybody write down what you got to write down. Keep it moving. But that's not enough, right? Like, failing to interact beyond trying to have people know, right? But the real reason, like, it doesn't work, which I hope by now we all noticed, is we don't live in a democracy. Like, when are we going to let go of the fantasy that we live in a democracy? I feel like, you know, I don't know if other people may remember the period when the Iraq War was beginning and it was like more people out in the streets than ever before and whatever. And they had the fucking war anyway and we're still in it. Like, it doesn't matter. You know what I mean? Like, we don't live in a democracy for so many reasons, right? Like, because of voter suppression, because of who you actually, what are the options, which imperialist to vote for. You guys know all this stuff. But like, the idea that the US is a democracy and like brings democracy through warfare all around the world still floats in like a lot of progressive spaces. So that's a really, like, I think that really underlies a lot of the sort of education alone, if people only knew framework. Okay. So we got to watch out for that one. That's really like, that could really soak up a lot of our time and like destroy our ability to like get together and do some things that you know, are the next level. Second, really disturbing, concerning liberal myth is the rule of law or the idea of sort of patriotic dissent. I'll give you a little image for that one. So the idea that the problem with Trump is that he's anti-constitutional. And if we just need to like bring the rule of law. The rule of law in the United States is genocide and slavery and heteropatriarchy. That is what it's always been about. The idea that the Constitution is this beautiful document, and if we could just string the right analysis through and get the right justices, then we would have equality. That is deeply, deeply untrue. So yes, it's true that Trump wants things that are anti-constitutional, and so does Obama, and so does every police officer and every ICE agent. Like, the law is lawless. Law enforcement is the reality, not whatever laws say. And we have to move past the fantasy that the rule of law is what we need to return to. And, you know what I mean? Like, no, right? Like, so that piece is really dangerous. And in general, a kind of like, there's a lot of appeal to our founders right now. I mean, you know, those slaveholders, like, no. We have to watch out for that. Do you see how the left, the supposed left, becomes a site of recuperation during an extreme right-wing moment? Remember Bush? It was the same way. It was like all the liberals went outside and felt like they did something, but it was actually like the message was so deeply watered down and became so patriotic, and it became about like the one bad guy who just wasn't smart enough, Bush, and that's why, you know, like, this is a really dangerous path that's deeply ineffective for the stuff we really have to fight around. I think another myth that we are facing is this idea that we need to move the middle. When I hear that, I think people are thinking about white, upper and middle class people. That's who people think the middle is. That's actually not true, but that's who people think the middle is. There's an idea, it's the same people who media is targeted to. There's an idea that those people, if we get them to think the right thing, things would be different. What we actually need is meaningful participation in movements with real entry points. That's true. We do need real entry points to our movements, real entry points to participation, and for newly politicized people and dissatisfied people to have entry points into action. That's not the same as shaping all of our messages to whatever we are projecting people who have the least to lose want. That's not the place to go, right? I mean, I think every left organizer who I admire and study all agree that it's working class people of color primarily and white people. That's who has the most to lose and is the most mobilizable and the most mobilized and have the most wisdom about the systems we're trying to dismantle. And it doesn't mean that people in that middle, whatever that is, I mean, they come along, that's great, you know what I mean? Like, but people usually get dragged along. Like I didn't live during the like key moments of late 1960s and 70s that a lot of us look at, sort of when there was a lot of broad cultural discussion of a set of things that movement activists had brought into play. But it really looked to me like people were dragged there by like working class people of color making radical militant movements. Not that those movements pitched their dreams to like, do you know what I mean? So that feels like that dilemma of moving to the middle, again, I think leads us to like very liberal, very watered down ideas about what needs to happen next. Another thing that's likely to happen during this period is an obsession with just defending prior recuperative moments. An idea of we just need to like go back to trying to get the Trump administration to recognize and include us like the Obama administration. That stuff didn't work anyway, right? A lot of people in this room have written books about that. That stuff doesn't actually change the distribution of well-being. And so becoming obsessed with just defending it feels like a real lost opportunity for actually mobilizing towards the world we actually want to live in. And overall, I think, the bottom line of all this is I'm worried about us just moving to a lowest common denominator like we did under the Bush administration. Trump is such a terrible racist, so everything else is fine. You know what I mean? That kind of thinking, like it just actually just moves the counter over. Really false calls to unity when actually we need to like look productively at difference and have like meaningful criteria. Watered down messages and kind of focuses on like individual scapegoat bad guy, In reality, the U.S. is war, right? And asking for kind of like kinder, gentler colonial rule feels very lost. It's killing me to watch people like celebrate the Obamas and Clintons right now. Like that's, what did those people really do? What have we gotten from them? I like to see the one around on Facebook. That's real. Okay. So what I've been trying to think about before the election and now in different ways is how can we figure out what is recuperative and what is liberatory? That's a really hard question, actually. What criteria do we use? How might we co-create norms for thinking about what's actually progressive or liberatory when we face both, on the one hand, recuperative reform proposals resulting from mainstreaming, and on the other, recuperative projects masquerading as urgent, radical, and left because of Trumpism, right? Like there's these two ways in which we get these recuperative projects emerging right now. I want less of this and more of this. Craig said this, he was like, now it doesn't mean we can burn flags all the time everywhere. Yes. But he said I shouldn't burn it on stage. Okay. So for years, I've been kind of thinking through this particular criteria, which will not be a surprise. Does it provide material relief? Because I'm concerned about things that are solely symbolic. Does it leave out an especially marginalized part of the affected group? Right? This is a kind of classic move of bad reforms and bad tactics. And a lot of times these days, it'll be like, everybody except for people with criminal records, or everybody except for people without immigration status, right? That's always regressive. Always the idea that we're going to come back and get those people is a classic problem in movements, a conservativizing move. Does it legitimize or expand a system we're trying to dismantle? So we never want to like add money or staff or buildings to the prison industrial complex, to the immigration industrial complex, or whatever the case may be. And does the ways we're doing the tactic mobilize the most affected for ongoing struggle? So is this actually building power, right? Like, is this doing stuff that causes more people to know each other, to have skills for organizing, to build relationships in their communities, to articulate their ideas about what needs to change, to name their conditions, to fight the next fight and the next fight? Those are the criteria I've been using for a long time, but I've been really into looking at other people's criteria. This guy, Peter Gelderloos, he's like a non-academic white anarchist scholar. He wrote a book that I love teaching, that I recommend to you for teaching, called How Nonviolence Protects the State. And then he updated it last year with a book called The Failure of Nonviolence. And in his book, he looks at a bunch of recent political moments around the world, and he asks this question: is it liberatory? His criteria are: does it see space in which new social relations can be enacted? So that question for him is, he's looking at things like the M15 movement in Spain or Occupy. He's looking at places where people like went outside and did stuff we're not supposed to do, like feed each other, live together, share books. Like, did people do social relations differently? That's, I think, a pretty interesting question, a different one that I hadn't asked. And those, he has pluses and minuses for the ones he looks at, but that's, I think, a really interesting criteria. Does it spread awareness of its ideas? He's not looking for it to just spread awareness in a passive way where you just receive, you've heard of it, but actually did people like start it in their own town, like Black Lives Matter chapter? Like, did people start their own Not One More actions? Like, did people take it up and do it somewhere else? Did people participate in the idea and make it their own? Does it have elite support? He's just like, if it has elite support, it's probably not liberatory. That's a hard one, I think, for people in the United States. We're like, oh my God, we got the New York Times to say something about it, you know what I mean? So I feel like that for me, when I read that, I just was like, oh, relief, that's so smart. I'm so glad you said that, it felt really good for me. I hope it feels good to you. And then, does it achieve any concrete gains in improving people's lives? So also interested in material relief. I also love this criteria, which I'm sure many of you have read, by Miriam Kaba. about police reforms. She's asking about how we know if a police reform is a good idea or not. She asks, does it allocate any more money to the police? Does it advocate for more police or policing, right? So like Seattle, where I live, which is like just this, you know, you can imagine like neoliberal nightmare in its own way. It's like kinder, friendlier, like, you know, everything every city is in the country. And they are like, we're gonna hire like women of color police who go in the streets and like shake hands with, you know what I mean? Like just like terrible ideas that are about always hiring more police to serve your specific community. And I can't believe this, the NYPD's ad campaign on the subways aimed at like people of color and queer people. Anyway, I wish I had pictures of that. But somebody's doing a good sticker campaign, and that's something we can all be doing on the subways against that ad campaign. She asks, is the reform primarily technology focused, right? So like things like having the police have less lethal weapons or body cams, right? That's an industry. That in no way reduces the impact of policing on people. It just adds more budgetary options for the police and builds the prison industrial complex, builds that industry, right? Like after the initial uprising in Ferguson, the stock of those kinds of companies that make less lethal weapons and body cameras like skyrocketed. We have to really think about that, right? Police violence is not a technological problem. And is it a focus on individual dialogues with individual cops, right? She's like, that, again, misses the whole framework. I just love this criteria because I think this is kind of the way we need to be thinking. Like, it's so incredibly grounded in material. I also love Harsha Walia. She wrote a book called Undoing Border Imperialism, which is also a really great teaching tool, wonderful reading group tool. And she's part of No One is Illegal, which has chapters across Canada, and she's part of the Vancouver chapter. And she asks, has the tactic been effective in exposing or confronting a specific point within the system by either diminishing its moral legitimacy or undermining its functions? To me, that really rings as the reverse of the counterinsurgency definition we read from the counterinsurgency guide, right? One of the examples of this that I think is really moving, that's just like a really amazing video to watch on YouTube is in 2008, No One is Legal Vancouver and many other groups in Vancouver organized really intensively around this man, Libar Singh, who was going to be deported. And when his day of deportation came, they organized about 2,000 people who all went to the Vancouver airport and shut down the international terminal and stopped his deportation. And I've never seen anything like that here. I mean, we do stuff here. Like I've been part of it, people, you know, blocking deportation buses and stuff. But this was like really next level. Imagine doing that in an airport. It's really intense. And it's a really beautiful video to watch. It's a great classroom tool. It really expands our imagination because it simultaneously like undermined its functions. Like they didn't deport Libar Singh that day. And it really lifts up questions about moral legitimacy. And her book is actually full of other examples of the ways that No One is Legal so thoughtfully does both individual casework about individual people facing deportation and work about many broad policies inside the Canadian immigration enforcement system that do these two things. And I think that they're really useful because a lot of times I think people engage in reforms that don't undermine the moral legitimacy of the system. They're like, it's okay to deport other people, but please don't deport this person. You know, like this, right? So how does No One is Legal toggle that? How do they handle that? How do they hold both and do effective individual casework while being called No One is Illegal? Like that itself is such a brilliant intervention. And then how do they collaborate with other organizations that are using various other strategies? Her book is like such a useful handbook for all of that. And then, I'm missing my other, sorry about that. I've been really enjoying Grace Hong's book, Death Beyond Disavowal. And actually, before the election, my speech was a lot about that book and its contributions. But one of the things that Grace does in that book is she talks about this key question from Audre Lorde. In what way do I contribute to the subjugation of any part of those who I call my people? It's from Audre Lorde's 1982 speech. And to me, this sentence captures something so deeply that is a part of women of color feminist political practice that has been like vital to all the movements that I've been interested in for my whole political life. This idea of constant reflection, of always asking like, who's not here? What's going on in terms of intra-group difference in the group that we're in, like being just constantly aware that we are always participants in exclusions and harms, and not having a notion of a pure political space or of anybody as a pure political subject. and what that is as like a daily practice, both organizationally and for each person engaged in these complex practices of political activism in which we challenge each other, in which we give each other difficult feedback. Like, what does it mean to sort of hold that question the entire time? You know, to ask, when I was preparing for this, I was really looking a lot at Reina's remarks at graduation at Hampshire College last year. I don't know if you all watched that video or read that speech. It's like really, really intensely brilliant and beautiful speech. And Reina talks about who's considered a nobody and who's considered a somebody. And I was really thinking about this regarding like, how does my own work make other people nobodies? And when am I aware of that and when am I not? And when am I trying to make myself a somebody by making somebody else a nobody? Or when are we making ourselves somebodies by making somebody else a nobody? You know, those questions I think are very deep for trying to form an ongoing reflective practice. Okay, so when I think about all of this work, I think about how this work is very, very, very fundamentally local work. Like the work we can do in the Trump moment it needs to be deeply local and deeply participatory, right? That is kind of where we're at. And there's a few sort of three key pieces, I think, which will not be surprising, of what I think that work might be. One part of that work is we need to do politicized survival work, mutual aid work. People are really in danger. It's not new that people are in danger. Our people have already been dying, being deported, being imprisoned, but there's definitely a ramping up that's about to happen. You know, what's going to happen to public housing? What's going to happen to healthcare? You know, the stock of the private prison industry has gone up. Like what in God's name are we about to see in terms of ramping up already intensely dire conditions? And mutual aid work is deeply concerned with nobodies. Like that, it's about putting nobodies at the center, to use Reina's frame. It's about work that says the people who are struggling the most are where we begin our analysis and take up actual action. So what this work means actually providing housing, healthcare, and education for each other. And to be totally honest, like our movements have not actually been that good at that, right? Like there's still like nowhere for homeless trans people to live. We have not sufficiently opened up our homes, our own spaces. We've relied on state structures that were never going to serve us, but now I hope we really realize they are never going to serve us, right? So what do we do when we actually recognize that we live in warfare conditions, the government against vulnerable people and their movements? Then what would we be willing to provide one another? You know, so many of us are really into like apocalyptic TV shows and novels, and in those people like carry water for each other and like shack up together and stuff, you know? Like it's time, you know what I mean? Let's do it. Mutual aid work is really, really vital. Part of what has, you know, I had a really good conversation with Ricky Mananzal about this, how for years and years, one of the things that's been so difficult is that funders have never prioritized local work, and there's always been focused on what we would call elite strategies. It's like, can you get an article in the New York Times? Can you change the mind of an elected official or a judge? That's the somebody strategy. We need the nobody strategy. That didn't work under the supposedly best conditions, right? Where those things are nodding and pretending they hear. It's really not going to work now. At that time, it also didn't give us anything. So how can we really shift that to a downward-looking strategy, a strategy that says, wow, is everybody in here okay? Like, does anyone need a ride? Does everyone feel like they have a safe place to go tonight? Like, what if that was how we, engaged with our spaces? So moving away from any idea of trickle down and towards trickle up. What this also means is like direct support for people in prisons, immigration proceedings, housing court, people seeking benefits, all of those kinds of spaces. There's a way in which a lot of people on the left don't touch that stuff. It's like, oh, like it's so complicated and administrative. But what happens is, and you see this all the time, when you are actually engaging in that work, like if you're actually yourself navigating a benefit system or navigating some kind of criminalization system, or if you're doing it with a family member or a friend, you end up learning a lot of the like horrible humdrum administrative details that are highly local in that place. That's the kind of expertise we need right now. All these things that we need to work on, they work differently in each prison, in each courthouse, in each city, in each county. So we need like all of us to be co-producing very localized expertise about how to throw wrenches into those systems and how to help people survive them right now. There's no reason every single person in this room and every single person we know can't be engaging in a prison pen pal project, learning about what's going on with evictions on your block and figuring out how to help people go to housing court and fill out forms. Like, that's the kind of stuff that there's actually a lot of us have a lot of things we could contribute to that, and there's never going to be enough poverty lawyers and enough social workers to do that. It's designed that way. Most people get turned away from services. And so if we don't do that, which we haven't been, people don't get what they need. And landlords can run with it, and medical systems that cut people out can run with it, and people just die early. And those stakes are higher than ever. So I feel like committing ourselves to boring paperwork with each other, or whatever part of that we each have, is whatever, learning things that you don't like learning, some of that, because we do that together, is actually really that now is the time for that. And accompanying people to those spaces. Doing direct support for people with disabilities, the level of endangerment of people with disabilities under the administration is, I think, incomprehensible right now. So what does it mean for everybody? You know somebody who's people who are so amazing, who think about disability justice when they go into any space, when they think about institutions, who have gotten that next level of savvy about thinking about disability justice and knowing how to provide support, connection, collaboration. We all need to bone up on that. It's really scary that so few people in general, that's such a siloed set of expertise and knowledge, and the level at which people with disabilities are left as nobodies by all of our movements and ignored and disappeared is wild. And that is just something that actually we can change our priorities around and change practice, and so that people with disabilities are at the center of our spaces, leading the analysis about what it is to produce meaningful engagement together. And then all kinds of accompaniment projects. Obviously, you see some of these starting up. I'm really excited about some of the ways that people are talking about accompanying people on subways, accompanying people to different spaces. We need that to really expand to sort of all those poverty locations in which people have to go meet with horrible people, Nobody should have to do that alone. The second piece of this is the dismantling work. There's a lot of that needs to be done, obviously. There's a new article by Tanya Unsueta that was looking, that I just read that I really loved. She works with Mi Gente, that was looking at how if we want to have a promise of this, this sanctuary city or sanctuary campus idea, we need to actually really shift to understand that we have to dismantle the police state. All of policing and imprisonment shuttles people towards deportation. And so this idea that we're just gonna say that maybe our police won't collaborate with ICE is not going to prevent people from being caught up in that system, because Trump has identified, just as Obama did, that the number one priorities for deportation are people who have contact with the criminal punishment system. So we have to do what I think the Movement for Black Lives and Mi Gente and the Not One More people have been doing, which is understand anything related to the sanctuary movement and deportation as utterly connected to the dismantling of the prison industrial complex and policing. Those things are together, and our standard for what sanctuary is, according to Tanya, has to be high. It has to be a standard of reducing policing, right? Eliminating policing, getting cops out of schools, all of that work that's been the dismantling PIC work, that work is also the sanctuary work, and that needs to be our standard. There was a pretty good article recently about the sanctuary movement in Santa Ana and the activists there demanding that it be meaningful and not just symbolic sanctuary, and I enjoyed reading this very local account of how people, what were they demanding, how were they saying, what were criteria were they using for what they thought would be sanctuary. That's the kind of, do you see what I'm saying? The kind of administrative savvy, the kind of up in boring administrative systems. No, that's the kind of stuff, that has to be we all are doing that. We're all going deep in particular systems and knowing exactly how they gobble up our people and how to untangle it, both for individuals that we're supporting and when we think about how would we dismantle this? Would that be symbolic, or would that actually do something? How would it do it? We don't want the city council to declare they've done it when we don't think they've done it. That kind of work, I think, is really vital right now. Oh wait, I didn't forward us. So local campaigns to reduce police, close prisons and precincts, stop new building of those things, obviously. We need to do the work to block deportations. I think we could ramp that work up. We need to block the public housing closures. I've been thinking a lot about Standing Rock and what would it look like when every time they try to close public housing, there's that kind of standoff. Can we imagine turning people out for every time they try to close a public hospital like that? You know what I mean? And in general, what that means to me is escalating tactics. It's definitely time to escalate tactics. And then the third piece is building the world we want to live in and preparing for the disasters, because we have a climate denier as president. So climate change denier. So it's going to keep getting a lot worse. And so everything we do to produce our shared safety in these moments also produces our well-being in the face of the worst disasters, right? Thinking about like Occupy Sandy or the people's recovery work that was done after the tsunami in Thailand. Like, we cannot count on governments to support us in those moments. We already know that. So what does it mean to think of every piece of work we do now as preparation for not only the disasters we're already living in, but like the pitched moments of climate-related disasters? One piece of this, which of course tons of people have been working on for so long, is alternative approaches to preventing and responding to violence without police. This is like a vital ongoing piece of work in our communities. We're still harming each other. How do we do work about harm that isn't centered in policing, that isn't centered in exile and punishment? Doing work about care and independency, lifting up feminist analysis, disability justice analysis, about child care, about caring for one another when we're sick, when we're disabled, when we're old. I mean, this is just, we're still really having a hard time with these things, as you guys, I'm sure, have noticed from your own lives. Seeing participation, having massive amounts of participation, right? We need everybody who's getting an idea right now to learn that they can do something besides just give to ACLU and Planned Parenthood, but instead they can participate right now in a politicized project about something they care about, accompanying somebody or supporting somebody through something like that. People feel like they want to help each other right now. That's a really amazing resource. And there's a lot of really liberal pitfall nightmare places that could go. So how do we provide, we have replicable models. We do. We have amazing President Pen Pal, projects like Black and Pink. We have lots of replicable models, but they're very tiny and local. So how do we start to actually replicate them and start them everywhere? We need so many of them because we have to provide each other with everything, right? And how do we do this through a framework that no one is disposable, right? I mean, this is just like our ongoing work. Like, how do we, I was thinking about Reina's work. I was thinking about the nobodies and somebodies. I thought about like people like Michael Johnson, the young college wrestler who was sentenced to 30 years in Missouri, supposedly for transmitting HIV. I think about Deborah Danner, who was killed by the police in the Bronx in October, who was a Black woman with schizophrenia. I think about all the people I correspond with in prison who've been labeled sex offenders. I think about people who've been considered monsters and nobodies at like pitched levels. What if that was the center of our movements? What if we actually had to deal with the idea of disposability at that level, right? And then also, what about like interpersonal disposability? Like, I never want to see you again because we're in this activist organization and it's really hard for me or annoying or what you've done is really painful to me. What if I assumed I had to see you for the rest of my life? Not every day, but like, what if I assumed, what if I assumed that we're in this together and wanted to find a way to work it out? That doesn't mean immediate or doesn't mean ignoring harm, but what if we treated each other like we were gonna still be around and worth being alive? And that is very hard in the era of social media. There's a lot of really intense ways in which people are playing out our experiences of harm and making each other disposable. And there's a lot of good reasons for that, but it's not working for us. It's like, making myself somebody by deeply trashing and dehumanizing another person or organization that's in my broader community is not working for us in a pretty profound way, as I'm sure you all know. So how do we try to keep each other even through conflict? Whenever I talk to college students who are like, 18 or 19, I'm like, I hate to tell you, but the people you dislike now, you'll be seeing them for the rest of your life. And there may become a time when you're the last two anti-marriage people on earth. And you're best friends or whatever, right? Like, you never know who your ally, somebody who feels like it's the most pitch difference in one moment. Later, actually, you realize, oh, we have more of the same values than we even knew. Possibly because you've become antiquated. But anyway, so it's a complicated thing to be critical and transparent and try to limit the toxicity of things like call-out culture. But I think it's something that we can do and it's possible for us to do. A lot of this is about building our emotional capacities to be together in movements for a long time. And that piece of the work is, I think, very under-discussed and somewhat taboo. Like, what do I need to survive in group processes? What do I need to change or learn about or expand? How can I get through being in conflictual group spaces? Like, those are conversations and questions that are actually like really worth asking, and I think have somewhat been neglected by our movements. And how do I take responsibility for the ways I might play out my wounds on others? And how do I learn to give and receive feedback with others? Those are hard things. But I think there are things that I'm seeing more and more discussion about in our movements and that are vital for us to be able to survive. We're in a time when people are pretty scared, I think. And there's a lot of different kind of problems facing people. I meet a lot of people who've been denied social movement histories, especially about tactics. Been really denied that kind of information. So it's a time when it's really important for us to study together, to have cross-generational dialogues about stories, about what we've done in different times, and to really try to lift up movement stories. People need them really badly right now. We also have a lot of people who I think, have been wounded in left movements and have been wounded in left organizations and have taken a step back, and we really need those people's talents and skills and abilities right now. Like people who organized against the DNC in New York City and made amazing things happen. Like, I want all of them to come back out and do something. And all these other moments when I was so amazed by different people's creativity. Like, there's so many skills, and it can be really hard to re-engage when you've been burned and left stuff, and it does happen. So I think that's like another piece that I think I meet people who have those skills, and I want to see that shift. It's a time when we need to be more militant, way more local, and more grounded in understanding of the nitty-gritty of how violence is administered in people's lives and what daily struggle looks like. I follow Reina's thinking that it is a time when we need to shift away from trying to be somebody to trying to center the question of why is anybody nobody? So that's all. I think there's time for a little Q&A, or just you could make comments of any kind. Curious to hear what you all are thinking about these days. One of the things that inspired me when I was thinking about this talk too was an article I read about this wage theft work, this work people were doing where they were like taking direct action against the people who were doing the wage theft. I've seen this in a few different places. I've seen people do this about grocery stores, and I've seen people do it about, I think people are doing it about hotel workers in Arizona. Like people doing it fails to go through the state to get these wages, right? So they're like doing direct actions against the employers for wage theft in this organizing level. And I wonder what we can, because it's so hard, using the proper channels to try to deal with like extreme labor injustice that we're seeing, and what would the next, I don't know, but what would the next level of militancy look like for like the struggle around adjunct labor? In Seattle a few years ago, the Fight for 15 march and like the kind of Fight for 15 struggle like had actually pretty big presence at my like relatively depoliticized Jesuit Catholic University. There was like a lot that went on campus about that and the fact that we have 70% adjunct labor. And it was like really amazing to see that struggle like really tied to the whole city's Fight for 15 struggle. So I'm just kind of like, I really don't know the answer to any of this, and I think there's a million people who are more thoughtful on this than me, but thinking about like, how there's so many people have these really like frustrating experiences of struggle, these labor struggles through various channels that feel like you just like unwinnable, or you're not winning what you want in a meaningful way. You're certainly not winning justice. And I wonder what that next level of militancy could look like. And I definitely think obviously that we have some historical things we can study, but also like labor is really different now than it was in some of the moments that people think of as peak labor activism in the United States, and how can we produce that differently? And I think one of the things, I don't know, I think one of the things is just participation. The more people are participating in movements about anything, like participating in the first thing is how you build your solidarity muscle and learn that the thing you're doing now is connected to the other thing over there and the other thing over there. And to me, the more people we have participating in anything, in New York City, the more likely those people are then going to participate in a struggle about CUNY, whether or not they are employees of CUNY or students of CUNY. And that's the thing that I feel like I want to see shift, is like levels of participation. And in general, we haven't, like, especially with like the way that funding has happened, funding hasn't been focused on social movements being more participatory. It's been focused on social movements being more elitist, or like just having like sort of policy reform agendas or electoral strategies. And so we've really, I think, people are demobilized. And so that I have that question about like how you win is you just are like unstoppable, ungovernable, like, so, you know what I mean? Like, so in their face, nonstop, right? These really strong showings. And so how would we get that sense of, that feeling about CUNY in all of New York City, which is as it should, because it is the city's university. It should serve the people of New York City, and there's all these ways in which it's inadequate. So I wonder about thinking about that broadly in terms of participation. But thank you for sharing that, and I'm sorry about your disappointing struggle.
Hi, Mr. Dean. Thank you. It was a pleasure to see you when I first met you, when you went to our transgender group at PHP, which now is owned by Housing Works. And your agency has helped a lot. I would say especially the immigrant community, transgender immigrant community will legally change their names. So you have done a wonderful job. I heard today your lecture, and as you know, I was taking notes, and some of that I couldn't take it off because they took it out, so but I copied, I would say 70% of it, because very interesting. So you're doing a good job. Congratulations on your project, and thank you. I congratulate you on your award tonight. Thank you. And my name is Dainik Martinez. And thank you for all the people that invited me, and thank you. I just did it like up to the page. Thank you. I am gender nonconforming, for those who don't know, transvestite, gender nonconforming.
Nice to see you.
Hi, hi, Dean. My question was sort of about, I feel like, the internet was around when Bush was elected and certainly Obama, but I feel like with this election, it's sort of been like digital media on steroids. And so I was wondering sort of about your thoughts about what's useful about digital and social media and where the harm and pitfalls are in that. Like, my particular concern these days is sort of false information and false media, and how quickly that can spread and the effects of that.
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking a lot about what's different for activists, like how when the battle in Seattle happened in 1999, Craig and I were living in LA, we had dial-up internet that we never used, and we found out about it kind of like while it was happening, because how else were we gonna, unless there was like something that would reach us in a zine ahead of time, and now I can follow local activist struggles from a distance, in a lot more detail, which can be really cool for studying what somebody's doing or how they're doing it. We can all learn so much for around the struggle to get rid of Joe Arpaio or something like that. And we can actually read things the activists wrote that aren't going to be, circulated in the general media. So I think there's a lot of potential opportunities, especially for our study practices. And I think that the internet's ruining our lives, totally, right? I mean, so it's I both, I feel both very intensely. I think the misinformation thing is really concerning, and also, I mean, just we are just really, human animals, and that is an affirmation machine, and people are really caught up in, of course we are, in getting seen and liked and known in a deeply individual way, and there's no shame in that, but it's really designed well for some of our wounds as people, and then as a result, it's really hard sometimes for people to break away from it and do other kinds of things. It can just only be about being seen in that way and being in a really individualized way, and that can also lead to a lot of the takedown stuff, because it's I'm going to prove that I'm better than you by, you know what I mean? So I'm how can we, obviously as Craig has taught me, all technology is both good and evil, but most of it's designed for the military primarily. But you know, I have been really amazed. Like there was that moment where there was kind of a little moment of blip of a moment of boycott of Facebook, and people were joining LO because they wouldn't let like trans people change their names or something. But nobody gives a fuck that Facebook is like best friends with the Israeli government and the NYPD. And like, you know, if people are getting filming the police attacking them, Facebook will shut down their feed for the police department. Like, we need to boycott the major media outlets that we are all using. And we have to do it together because it's not meaningful. And somebody who's young and knows how to do that stuff needs to lead it. And, you know, I mean, I feel really like, I read an article that really helped me think about this was Eric Stanley and Toshio Moronic wrote this article, maybe it was a year ago or so, about when the idea of Twitter feminism was circulating. And they wrote this piece that was just like, what are you guys talking about? Twitter is just is just a corporation that's like destroying the city of San Francisco. Like it's a material thing that's like getting tax breaks and like, you know, gentrifying and pushing people out. Like we have to understand that things like Twitter and Facebook are corporations for which we write all the content, you know? And so that's pretty wild. And I hadn't thought about it that way at all. And I feel like the question is, you know, how do we take what works about some of these platforms for sharing information and having more outlets beyond corporate media, and also recognize the way in which we're still being completely contained by corporate media strategies. And so I am definitely ready for people to really begin like the earnest boycotts of those platforms that are so deeply antithetical to any of our left movements like Twitter and Facebook. I don't know how to do that, but I'm calling for it. Please, somebody do it right.
So I was wondering if you could expand on kind of 2 points. So that myth point that you mentioned about, you know, like if they only knew that point. I mean, I think also, at least what I was hearing and what I've also heard from folks is this kind of like false hope also of like, now we see, right? Like with the Trump, now we see what's happening. And so the importance of like political education on those points, but also then with attention to your work and not just like that being purely academic, but also what you were speaking to and also Reina's work, importance of like art and other forms of like political education and why we need those. Especially in ways to like capitalize, I guess, and I don't know what other word to use, off of the moment we're in, but not in this kind of like false hope of like now people get it, or if they were to get it, right?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think that for me, that's what I'm thinking about how our movements need entry points. It's like some people are just noticed that the United States is racist, and that's wild, you know, and you know. And so how do you move, or people, or it's too racist for them finally or something. And that's, you know, different than where other people are. But what, in the ideal world, we would take that moment where somebody's actually feeling solidarity or mobilization, and it would be like, we would have movements that genuinely invited people to join and participate and help them like learn things that they've been denied information about or denied understandings of and denied practices of. Like that's the best case scenario, is that our movements are, you don't have to be a card-carrying prison abolitionist to talk to me. You know what I mean? Not, you know, but instead, oh, you were really upset by that incident or this rhetoric. Wow, like here's how to get involved very locally on the thing that upset you, and here's how the small collective that's working on this accompanied project because you're scared for people in your school having this experience or whatever, that collective is actually in like a conversation and partnership with the collective that's doing something about deportations and the collective that's doing something about public housing and the collective that's working on the other street, like that, you know, doing eviction defense, like that would be the ideal, is that we have political ed that is not solely passive reading, even though obviously I love reading, you know, but like political ed that is something that you don't have to want to go find it. It's like you're participating in something, and as a part of participating, you learn things with other people. And sometimes, you know, organizations like, you know, I think one of the best models of this is the, you know, for years, the Education and Liberation Project at Fierce, where there was like these kind of semester-long type of programs where young people who are members of Fierce, who are LGBTQ people of color, would like go through a whole thing of like learning what a campaign is, learning movement history, learning how to do different parts of Fierce's work, learning the history of the peers in the local context in New York City, like that, you know, so it's both skills building and political context building, and learning how to do organizing with other people in your community, and then through that learning, you gain more leadership in Fierce, and then you help teach that to the next set of people, like that. Those kinds of models, which are very classic organizing models, I think are really vital, because people, like, everybody can know the war in Iraq is illegal. all day long, and on it goes. Like that, the knowing was not the resistance that we needed. It wasn't sufficient. It mattered. It's good that we knew. It's better that we know than that we don't know. There's lots of things we don't know still, but like the knowing is just, I think that's just that liberal mythology. Like if they only knew, I really see that. Like I think I see that with my students a lot of times when they first learn about stuff they didn't know about the US and racism and colonialism and stuff. They're like, oh my God, if people knew, and it feels really real because that denial of knowledge is real. And sharing our movement's knowledge is meaningful. It's not that that's not meaningful, but people need also ways to plug into participation and be together. I think one of the dynamics of a stage we are in capitalism and the context of technology and social media is that people are deeply, deeply isolated and have very few interactions in person. And I think a lot of people need more chances to do that, to build some of the skills that are going to help us, like when the storms come, when the next earthquake comes. You know what I mean? Like and the government is not there again. So we need more complex skills around that don't come solely, I think, from learning. And I learned so much from Reina really specifically about this piece around people need chances to learn in ways that are fun and feel good, and that is like we need to feel moved and delighted, and we need truly deeply multidisciplinary political education, and that has not been lifted up by the left often. It's been, it can get really didactic and talking headsy, and I am guilty of that. So I feel like that piece around like how we deeply integrate artwork into every part of organizing. And when you look at really successful movements, they do it. You know what I mean? Like that's and you have events people want to go to where they like might meet someone they like or hear really awesome music or see a really hilarious film or like see a play and learn about themselves through that. Like that is actually what works, and that boring meetings are really important for some of us, but there are other things in life beyond boring meetings, and so I think that's a growing edge. I think certainly for me, that's not been the center of my work. I've been into boring meetings. Yeah, thanks for that question.
I'm a social worker, and I work at an organization up in Harlem that serves LGBTQ homeless youth, both like a community center and a housing program. And so when you mentioned looking not to the police to help us, like when there's a violent incident or something like that, like, on our block, if we have this guy that comes around, he's often recruiting our young girls for sex work, or people recruiting our youth for gangs, and just like, or random youth just like getting in fights. Anyways, we always have to call the police because like who else are we going to call? And so I want to hear from you more like specific ideas of what we can do to not involve these people that then like can hurt our community more.
Yeah, that's a great question. There's so many amazing people working on that all around the country. So maybe partly what I'll do is just point you to some things. I mean, I think that contradiction, the fact that like youth serving agencies often then engage in criminalizing youth is really intense and common, and it's so great to meet people who are who want to shift away from those policies. And there's a lot of different groups working on that. There's I think one piece of it is people just building de-escalation strategies of all kinds, and building like communication de-escalation strategies so that lots of things can start before anyone calls the police. And also having like young people learn their own negotiation de-escalation strategies instead of having like adults or staff or whatever do that. That's like, I think that work is really meaningful, and a lot of people are doing that work in schools specifically, but I think it also works at youth organizations, like just people teaching each other ways of getting through conflict moments that don't escalate. So I think that kind of skill building stuff, which is a form of political education, is really useful, and putting it in the context of talking about being an anti-policing practice, But then, there's a lot more. There's like the whole realm of transformative justice work that a lot of people are building on, and so there's like tons of organizations and writing about that. I really love this PDF that I'm obsessed with called Toward Transformative Justice by Generation 5 that you can find online for free, that really outlines some of what transformative justice looks like. They're talking about it in terms of ending child sexual abuse and talking about why policing and criminalization is not an effective tool for doing that, and how we could think differently about responding to harm and about when we're bystanders to harm beyond failed strategies of policing. So I think that's a useful tool. There's a wonderful book called The Revolution Starts at Home, which many people in this room contributed to. It's an anthology full of accounts of people using strategies beyond criminalization, especially for intimate partner violence, which I imagine is an issue within the youth you work with. And then I think the other piece of it is like, self-determination, like having young people get to make their own real choices about who they collaborate with, what kinds of work they do, like really how to support people. Sometimes people make choices out of desperation. In my experience, a lot of people make choices that are hard for them often because of things like lack of adequate housing, lack of health care, lack of cash. And so if there's dangerous choices being offered to people, the question is, do they have the best tools possible so that they can make whatever choice they want to make in the way that's most, not coming from a space of desperation. I think a lot of times people have a hard time with everything when they don't have those things they need. And so it can be hard, I think, for orgs to tell people not to join gangs or not to do sex work when they don't have the basics, It's just not a realistic frame, and it might not make sense for folks. But yeah, I think that I also recommend looking at the work of Project NIA in Chicago. There's so many groups that are doing, and Miriam Kaba, one of the writers I mentioned, she's doing great work on this and writing, and she just had a gathering recently that was related to people doing like non-police-based community accountability work. There's so much going on around the country, really in every city, that is thoughtful and taking this from a different angles. And I think some agencies, specifically youth agencies, are trying to move away from things like running warrants with the police or things like that have been historically ways that youth services has been a direct collaborator with criminal punishment. So yeah, thank you for thinking about that work and working to change that. Yeah, I think each of us just has realms of influence. And so we go where we have realms of influence, right? And that's like, right, the worst model of like college service learning programs is like the poor and needy people over there in another country, and you should go there and save them, right? So, right, it's like, yeah, like you have influence over this set of students and you're figuring out like what they respond to, and that's what each of us should be doing. It's just like trying to, and one thing that happens to me in the classroom, I don't know if that happens to anybody else, sometimes I project too hard on the student who's like, hates it, and then I'm actually forget that there's a bunch of students who desperately need this. So we don't want to over-focus, right, and only serve the student who's most resistant. That can be a danger because then we're often underserving the same students who are underserved in all the other classes. So that's always like a complexity, like for me with like really, with a classroom where I'll have like 3 students who desperately want to hear the kinds of things I want to talk about, and like a bunch of students who are like really happy with law school and don't want to hear, you know what I mean? And how to really like have a mixed group where, and also, yeah, so that's a really complex thing, and that's true in every group. There's just like, any group, you just have people who have depth in certain areas and others who don't in others, and how can you make a space in which it's okay to not know some stuff, and in which we take like these ideas seriously, and like the danger, right, for if I were to put only things on my syllabus that my students that were more legitimate, is that like I really want my students to read like, Black scholars, to read Indigenous scholars, to do these. It's not going to happen on the rest of the law school curriculum, and for them, that's harder for them to take serious. You know what I mean? So there's so many balances, but I think that the kind of inquiry that you're talking about, like the not throwing people away, is not about pretending that I can equally influence everyone. Like I was like, who's going to come to the Kessler lecture? I didn't pitch it to you guys like you're a bunch of first-year law students, right? I was like, oh no, I have a guess. It's a projection. I could be wrong, but like I have a guess about what you all might like want to hear about. If I were to think about my different thoughts tonight after the election. And that's different than what I would say to a group of people for whom it's still like, well, maybe racism is over because we had a Black president, which was like some of my students. And then we'd start somewhere different, and I just think that's what we're all doing. That is, and I think all kind of political ed work does that, thinks carefully about, where people are starting from in like a loving, compassionate way, and asks us all to move, and then also thinks really carefully about who's most likely to have been addressed, and who always gets left out of what's addressed, who's not the middle, right? So we always have to do that work as well, which I think is can be complicated in mixed spaces, like especially if we're teaching at universities and we've got a bunch of anti-immigrant students, then we've got 2 undocumented students in the classroom. They shouldn't have to sit through a really liberal, you know what I mean? Like we have to make sure the content is not continuing the harm that continues that marginalization, and that can be, I think, challenging for depending on what kind of institution you're at.
So you spoke a little bit about not, maybe I'm wording this wrong, but not calling people out because it's not working for us and it's doing further harm. But how do you sort of navigate that without tone policing or without sort of silencing people when injustice does happen?
Yeah, I think that's really great. Yes, and I definitely am not like against calling out, because obviously there's good reasons in which we bring up harm that's happened, in which we name dynamics, and I think the concern about tone policing is really real. I think a really common dynamic is like white people feeling like, you know, someone says something I've done or said or way I've been is racist, and then I'm like, but the way they said it was angry, so I don't have to listen to it. Like that kind of, that's really common dynamic, right? Is for us to say that the way the critique came was wrong. And that's not useful. It's a very classic way that like people in positions of power, also like professors or administrators, you know, deal with critique. So yeah, I mean, what I'm saying is not I don't have a absolute. What I have is an awareness from looking around my own experiences and our movements that, you know, we all are acting a lot of stuff out on each other. And there's a lot of complex harm in all of our relationships, whether you're in movements or not. That's just kind of everywhere. And figuring out how to give and receive feedback, figuring out how to not be centered in punishment or shaming, but instead, like, I feel like when harm has happened, the goal is to prevent it from happening again, have the person that happened to be as safe as possible for moving forward. Like, can I still go to a party again, or could I still feel comfortable riding my bike again, or whatever it is that was where the, you know, like what do I need? What kinds of accompaniment do I need? What kinds of support do I need to be as well as I can be? Not, you know, with there being no like standard of finality in that, and to try to have, if there was a harm doer, have that harm not happen again, or like sometimes the harm is like in an entire organization. How do we like look at what happened and see if it could, what would we all need to do to have this not happen again? What would we all need to do to make people safer when things like this could happen? So to move towards prevention. And sometimes I think in our community is kind of more of the shame and punishment, exile stuff happening. That is not always towards preventing things from happening again. So some of those questions that are really hard are like, how much of this should I do on social media, and how much should I do in other kinds of spaces of mediated conversation? What do a lot of people need to know about this, and what do only some people need to know about this? Like, what's about stigmatizing someone for life, and what's about preventing this harm? Like that, and there's just not clear answers to that stuff, but I just think I mean, there's tons of writing about this, and I think a lot of us are just struggling with seeing the complexity there, because the thing about social media is it gives everybody a platform to potentially like really intensely stigmatize and accuse. And then a lot of us also have some bystander roles, like when somebody's been accused of something, we ice them out, instead of also thinking, okay, what kinds of care do they need? Because probably the thing isn't gonna not happen again by them being more isolated. You know, like that's not likely to prevent harm. So there's just a lot of pieces of that, and that's work that actually, I think Miriam Kaba is one of the people thinking about that a lot. But you know, many other activists, like how do we produce responses to harm that actually heal everyone in the situation and prevent, rather than leading to like more stigma and divide. And I don't have the answer to that. I just think it's something that like I would love us all to be deeply concerned about and experimenting with and supporting each other around. Like just noticing, am I collaborating and stigmatizing someone? Am I collaborating and excluding someone? Am I collaborating and denying or minimizing harm? You know, like what, you know, how do I know who in my friends can I check in with? How do we look at our value around this? Am I making myself somebody by participating in making somebody else nobody? Why? You know, like, I think those are difficult questions right now, but they're very much up.
I kind of feel like on one hand, what you're saying is that this is not a time to be cautious with our politics. And then on the other hand, at the end saying something that I really want to hope for myself that I can do, which is to live in a world in which I can see everybody, maybe not every day, but every other day or every week, and kind of live with that sort of critical empathy. But it's just hard for me to look at my students of color in the face anymore and say to continue doing the thing which they've always had to do, which is to extend the hand, and which is to, I I guess I'm just wondering when that discourse of critical empathy or discourse of civility becomes one of complicity and reproduces, you know, like people are tired of having to talk about this and having to say, like, do you really think so little of me and my body that, like, I have to now sit here on top of all those feelings and all that affective labor and explain to you or work with you or collaborate with you or teach you, right? This thing that we've been doing and what was always latent for so long and now is just is turned into some sort of dystopic nightmare before our eyes. I don't know. I don't know if we can do both those things. And I guess I'm just asking, you know, what is that critical empathy? What is the hard work of that? Is that something that we just can't let harden us? And why do we always have to be the people that have to do that kind of labor of not being hardened?
Yeah, and I really appreciate your critique of the concept of civility in that. That's really vital. Yeah, I mean, it's not about everybody being nice to everybody. That is never, you know, like that's not helpful, and that is such a, that is a discourse that's used to like censor and exclude primarily people of color, indigenous people from, I mean, even the words, you know, civilizing that's inside that. But I feel like, yeah, I mean, I think none of this is about a demand that people in the one down position educate people in the one up position. You know what I mean? Like that can never be what this is about. I think I'm thinking more about the harm people do to each other, throwing each other away in inside movements more horizontally. I think it's totally great to like have, you know, students of color feel completely like, absolutely, I will not do this education work in this classroom for white students. I mean, of course, like that's vital, and part of our role as facilitators for those of us teaching is to like really catch those dynamics and look at that, and you know, and not allow that entitlement on the part of the white students or the faculty or the administration. I mean, all of that stuff is so vital. I mean, how many schools where they get those students of color to do the racism training for the faculty for free, or where they get those trans students. I mean, all, you know, that's just stuff. It's just, will that ever die? I don't know. But the piece around, I just think that what's not working for us is just we all have moments of just like, you know, taking as our target someone who's this close and being like, they said that thing wrong or they did that thing wrong, and then just like having that be the place where we really bring a lot of our most intense critique. And it's like I just wonder how that's working for us. I'm not laying out any rules. Like, I mean, obviously maybe that's all we can do. That's okay, you know, but like I for myself, I'm looking at that, and like one thing that I've been talking to some people about is like, I was thinking it might be good for some of us who've been through major conflicts inside politics and then actually come back together with somebody we had conflict with and formed a deep relationship or restored our relationship, to write about that. Maybe it took 6 years, maybe it took 10 years, maybe it took 6 months, but this was my side of it. I actually did this fucked up shit to this other person, and then I was so mad at them, and they were so mad at me, and it hurt so bad, and we were so humiliated, or we were so whatever, and then later we were friends again or collaborators again. I think we should write more of those stories. I think people could really use those, especially people who are at the beginning of a experience like that. Like, how do we have, I don't know, just how do we deal with the fact that we're not going away from each other? You know what I mean? Hopefully. Like, I hope we're all get to stick around as much as possible. So how do we form some models for conflict resolution, or for the possibility of hoping for it to shift, or for forgiveness? Like, I just think we need a bit of that. And since we spend a lot of our time developing these really important critical tools, sometimes that skill is super sharpened and some other skills aren't. But that is not a call for like everyone to be nice, or like for us to critique each other if we didn't say it nice enough. You know, like, no, that's really not what I mean at all. Thank you for raising that clear distinction. I appreciate that. But now we have hors d'oeuvres.